Hello, and welcome to a special hour-long edition of Focus One. It is Friday, September 29, and we are on location at New College of Florida campus on beautiful Sarasota Bay. We have a very, very special guest today, Ms. Gillian Sorensen. She is a senior advisor to the United Nations Foundation, has a very long and distinguished career with the United Nations. We're going to talk about that a little bit, talk about her career path. We're going to talk about the United Nations apparatus, the United Nations Foundation as well, and then we'll get Ms. Sorensen's impressions from this week's UN General Assembly meeting in New York. We'll take a little bit of a break then, and we'll come back and we'll get some questions from some of our talented students here at New College. So without further ado, Ms. Gillian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's just start off and talk a little bit about how you came to be working with the United Nations.
Well, my studies and interests had been in international affairs and French. I majored in French. I lived in France for my third year of college. And when I came to New York, I was working for a then congressman named Ed Koch. And he declared soon after that as a candidate for mayor. I got very involved in the political campaign, and he won. He was one of 8 candidates, but he won and served 12 years as mayor of New York. Yes, and there is a small office in city government called the New York City Commission for the United Nations and Consular Corps. And I had the opportunity to lead that office. It's the liaison office between New York, between the host city, and 30,000 diplomats. We have the largest diplomatic community in the world based in New York. And I loved the job. The boundaries were the city of New York, but the constituency was international. And we worked on all kinds of matters ranging from security and school placement to some discrimination cases and other issues related to their presence in New York, tax questions and reimbursement for police protection and so forth. So it was a wonderful time in my life, and I became known as something of a bridge builder. And that's what led to being recruited then into the UN Secretariat by then Secretary General Boutros-Ghali.
And so let's continue. What did you start doing? What were you working on when you moved over under?
Well, for the next 10 or 11 years, I worked first for Secretary General Boutros-Ghali and then as Assistant Secretary General for Kofi Annan. And I had a variety of responsibilities at different times, some to do with travel, with schedule, with his outreach to American audiences, and particularly to the universe of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. There are 4,000 accredited ones at the United Nations. And also over time, I developed almost a subspecialty in doing briefings. I enjoyed it. And so when visiting groups of any kind came through, whether it was members of parliament or a military group or a model United Nations, I would very often be called on to do the briefing and take the questions. And so that exchange and my increasing confidence in doing that led to my subsequent career after I left the UN Secretariat, and that's being an advocate, or as people in the South say, a sort of itinerant preacher or teacher on the issues related to the United Nations and the US and the UN.
I'm going to come back in a second to talk about the foundation, but I want to go back to the work that you were doing. That sounds wonderful. I mean, I look around the students, they want that job, I think. That sounds like a terrific job. I want to ask you one question about the NGOs that you were working with. We're taking right now a global environmental politics course. A number of the students you see sitting around you are in that course, and we've just finished up a week in that course, as well as one in a parallel course on world politics, generally speaking, looking at NGOs. Yes. And whether or not they matter, if they're influential and how they're influential. How do they make a difference?
Oh, I think they matter a great deal. Of course, in the world at large, there are 100,000 NGOs. They are self-organized. usually single issue groups. They're self-funded, and they're very important. They are really the voice of the people. And those participants, those leaders are passionate about their issues. They have learned how to dramatize and publicize and raise awareness and raise funds, and how to lobby their own governments on these issues. And they cover every issue that you can imagine, from human rights to environmental protection, to war and peace issues, and so forth. And I think they are very important. Kofi Annan used to say they were our indispensable partners.
So you say that they had a significant degree of influence on diplomatic positions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the UN itself, the staff there couldn't possibly do all we have to do. There are NGOs, for instance, who are experts on refugee matters, and they go to the front lines. They work with us. It is often the UN who does the coordination and the overall direction, but these groups, like the International Rescue Committee, for instance, others like that, are really essential to do what we need to do.
Tell me a little bit about the difference between the United Nations, tell me a little bit about the United Nations Foundation, where you're working right now as a senior advisor, and then we can come back and just say a few words about the sprawling apparatus that the United Nations architecture is.
The UN itself, of course, was formed in 1945, so it has a long history. But the UN Foundation is very young. It's only 13 years old, and it was launched by Ted Turner of CNN, who was upset because, not for the first time, the U.S. had fallen into arrears. We had not paid our dues to the UN, which is, in my view, both a legal and a moral obligation. And he said at a big event in New York that he was going to give $1 billion to pay those dues. Well, as it turns out, an individual can't pay a nation's dues, but the commitment was very real. The $1 billion was real, and it took half a year to set up a new foundation called the United Nations Foundation. It is outside the UN, independent of the UN, but its mission is to help the UN do more, do better, reach further, and to help build partnerships around the world with others who want the UN to succeed. And I think it's done a remarkable job. Ted Turner is still the chairman of the board. And
who are some of the folks on the board? What does that board look like?
It's a very, very distinguished international board with leaders from United Kingdom, from Brazil, from China, from Russia. It's not a large board, but they're outstanding people from both the academic and the political world. But the headquarters of the UN Foundation is in Washington.
And it works fairly closely with the UN, I would imagine, yes.
It does.
Okay, one of the things that I know when we hear the United Nations, or when the United Nations gets into the media, it's often with the Security Council, and we can come back to that a little bit later. But I don't think folks fully appreciate the broad range of activities and programs that happen under the auspices of the UN. Maybe you could just tell us about some of what you view to be some of the more important work that sort of flies under the radar.
Yeah, you're very right on that. If you ask somebody on the street, they might know of UNICEF, the Children's Fund. Sure. Or they might have heard of one peacekeeping operation, but they have no idea of the broad reach, the breadth and the depth of UN work. So if I can just scan that, you might begin with peacekeeping, because that does make a lot of news, and we have 16 peacekeeping operations going on. But then keep in mind disarmament and counterterrorism work, and development. That's working with the poorest of the poor around the world. And democratization, that's reinforcing free governments and new fragile democracies. And human rights, of course, and humanitarian relief for 20 million refugees today as we sit here. And in the last month, 700,000 more have joined that group because they're fleeing Syria. And environmental action, climate change efforts, and global health, which of course affects us all, and reproductive health, safe birth, and much more. But that's the reach of it, and clearly every one of these issues is a global matter that requires global work, that is joining together in the cause, sharing information, they often say burden sharing. You share the cost, the risk, the responsibility, and we trust the benefits of joined action. And every one of the issues I just mentioned crosses borders, and of course we have to look at it as one world.
If you don't mind, I want to probe just a little bit on environment and the UNEP program, just because, again, it's one of the things that we've been talking about in class here. Unlike some of the other areas, UNEP's a program rather than its own agency, and some of the readings that we've been discussing lament, I guess, sometimes the lack of coordination across the different programs, and that some of the programs would be stronger if perhaps there was a united, a world environment organization or a stronger, more centralized entity. You have any feelings on that?
I would resist setting up yet one more environmental group. I think United Nations Environmental Program is good, and it could be better. As with any part of the UN, it's not perfect. The problem, of course, is that the United Nations can give the road map for this to happen. It can convene and bring people together to present the evidence and to raise the awareness and the alarm, if you will, about what environmental change is doing to our planet. But the UN itself can't make it happen if the various member states are not taking action in their own countries to do what has to be done. And by that, I have to include our own, the United States. Everybody is, no, maybe not everybody, most people, many people are beginning to understand that climate change is real, and it is happening right now. And there will be real consequences if we don't take steps from here onward to address this. But there are a lot of countervailing forces. There are business interests that really don't want this to happen. They say it'll cost something. Well, yes, it will, but it'll cost us a lot more down the road if we don't take action now. I was in China this year, and it's in many ways, it's astonishing and impressive what's happening in China, and the growth and the drive and the motivation. But the air pollution in Beijing was so thick, I could not see across the street from my hotel room. And a Chinese friend said, oh, it's the price of progress. But it is a very heavy price, and I don't doubt for a moment that it affects the health of anybody who lives there more than a month. And those decisions have to come from the top. Governments have to really commit to that. Grassroots groups, NGOs have a role, but without government setting some norms and standards and rules and regulations, it's not really going to happen.
I want to switch gears. Gillian, you've just come from New York, General Assembly meeting. We had an opportunity to speak last night for a few minutes, and you were lamenting the fact that these days the media tends to cover what the hottest story is. And so for the last couple of years, it's been the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I noticed this morning that one of the lead stories was talking about the Iranian delegation's spending spree. A little bit of an obsession with the Ahmadinejad and the Iranians, and there's a lot of other speeches that you had said, well over 100, that don't get as much attention. So maybe you can give them some attention. What were some of the more important things that you think you heard that weren't coming from
Sometimes I think that good news doesn't make news, or that the press is drawn to the leader who speaks, the bombast, the saber rattler. But this September, as every September when the General Assembly opens, almost every world leader on earth comes to New York. We had more than 130 this time, presidents and prime ministers. They all have the opportunity to speak in the General Assembly at that green marble podium. You've seen it many times. And they all take it seriously. That's a very important speech, not just for the press in New York, but for their home constituencies. And it's true, the press gave almost all the attention to Ahmadinejad. I regret that, because a lot of other leaders were saying important things, interesting things, focusing on, in some cases, on the events in North Africa and the Middle East, on the Arab awakening and all the turmoil around that. In other instances, on circumstances closer to their own countries, to do with poverty or food security or environmental impact. President Obama, that is the US president, is always the second speaker by tradition. Brazil leads, US is second. And he made, I think, a very interesting and important speech. First remembering the remarkable American diplomat who was killed in Libya very recently, Chris Stevens. And then talking about the circumstances in the Middle East. And not just about the events, but about the underlying causes. And then focusing on a subject that I've not heard him address here before, and that is the issue of free speech. What does it mean? How does it affect us? How do we stand up for free speech even when we may disagree with what's being said?
How was that received by the leaders of the rest
not
of the
everyone
world?
agreed, of course, because we have more or less the maximum degree of free speech. And our theory is if you don't agree, the antidote to that is more free speech, because you have the right to respond, and we think that's healthy.
Was it a clear democracy, autocracy breakdown, or was it a little bit more mixed and matched in terms
Not
of?
entirely, because you have some new delegations, and even if they may not agree, they're in the hall. They hear those words. It prompts their thinking, I believe. And they look at how it works in the United States, indeed in New York City, which is the most diverse city on earth, where everybody speaks up, and we're accustomed to demonstration in support of this or opposing that. It's normal for us. I think that's a good lesson, both what they see and what they hear when they come to New York. So we'll see. Not all countries are ready or able to accept the degree of free speech that we accept as the norm.
I found it to be it was a bit of a delicate tightrope act for the president. He is in a very contentious campaign. There's no way around that. If one were to use the UN speech purely for domestic campaign purposes, I don't think that would be wise. Nevertheless, you can't completely forget about how it's going to be spun. He kind of walked that tightrope pretty well. I think he was getting a little bit of pressure from the Romney campaign on not being a vigorous defender of free speech and values, and I guess he was, at least to me, it seemed he was able to kind of articulate a message that was appropriate for that audience, and yet he kind of boxed out some of the pressure he was getting here.
I agree with you. Every fourth year during our presidential election, whoever is running, whoever is president, has that slightly delicate situation, because of course our own election is coming very soon.
If you had to just pick one other speech that you heard that you just found a little bit provocative, it just made you think a little bit more. You're typically at a parade. If there's one or two that stand out.
I was very taken by the speech of President Morsi, the new president of Egypt. And you know, Egypt it's a very difficult transition. They are not accustomed to democracy and all the back and forth that we're used to. But I'm seeing evidence that he is actually a very strong person. He has clear ideas of having civilian, not military, but civilian leadership of Egypt. He has taken steps to set the military in their place and to remind them that they are accountable to the leader of the country. And he said other things about the transition that they're going through that I thought acknowledged that it was going to be different, that it was not going to be the authoritarian leadership that they had had for the last 20 or 30 years, and that he was ushering in change. At the same time, he is a devout Muslim. He has been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not going to instantly transform into a democracy like ours, but I think we'll see remarkable change in Egypt. And I put my best hope there because Egypt is a huge country. It could be, if it works, it could be the model for the region as to how there can be transitions between one leadership and the next as time goes forward, and a greater degree of activity by opposition parties, by a free press, by an active and accountable judiciary, and so forth, to a measure that has not been seen in Egypt in a very long time. So it's worth going back to that particular speech. I thought it was quite remarkable.
That's very, very helpful. Let's stay with this for a moment on the issues of transition in the Middle East. I'm glad there might be some signs of hope. In Egypt, let's shift over to Syria, because that's the one that is depressing folks. Is there anything there that you can point to that might be hopeful, given, and this gets back to, I think, one of the frustrations with the United Nations Security Council and procedures, when you have 5 veto players, very powerful countries with different interests, we often get China, Russia to block agendas, or blocking, again, with greater pressure to be put on the Assad regime.
I'm an optimist, so I always believe there's hope. Syria is a fascinating country. It had an educated middle class. It had a thriving business community. It had international people coming and going, and so forth. But now they're locked into what I think can be called a civil war. And President Assad has taken a path that I think is deeply regrettable, to crack down on his own people.
Is there any way this ends with Assad still in power?
I don't see it.
And how can we get him to step down without the Chinese and the Russians acquiescing?
It is a matter of time, because I think the rebels, that is the opponents, will persist. They're outgunned by the government. But I think the determination and the will to have a freer government, a freer Syria, a new leader, is indomitable. We'll see. You're correct. The Security Council has been stymied because China and Russia, 2 of the permanent 5 members, will not support taking a much stronger Security Council action or peacekeeping operations there.
Do you think there's any chances of the Chinese or the Russians softening a little bit and assisting the rest of the world in terms of pressuring?
The key is the Russians, and in both cases they have commercial interests and other interests. But honestly, I think they do not want to see repeated what happened in Libya, and that is regime change coming out of a Security Council action. And for a variety of reasons, political and otherwise, they're holding firm on that. Well, if the Security Council won't move, what else is possible? The United Nations is sheltering refugees. I mentioned 700,000 who fled over the borders in Yemen and Jordan and Lebanon and so forth. Some countries are supplying arms to the rebels or advice. But the United Nations has sent 2 emissaries now. The first was my former boss, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, who accepted an appointment as special envoy to Syria. One might say it was mission impossible, but he did everything humanly possible. He met with President Assad, he traveled to Moscow, he traveled to Beijing, he went back to Damascus, and he's a very persuasive person.
He tried.
He tried very hard, but eventually it became clear that Assad was not going to move an inch, although Kofi Annan gave him, in effect, a way to proceed. But I think he spoke about stepping down with dignity. Well, eventually it was clear that was not making headway. He came home, he reported, and now a second envoy, a very experienced man named Lakhdar Brahimi, has been sent. He comes from the region. He knows it like the palm of his hand. He'll try another tack, But to achieve peace, you need a cooperative partner on the other side. And at this moment, we don't have it.
Yeah, I've been avoiding having the Iranian nuclear program dominate the conversation. But we do have to I want to take a little bit of time to go back there. One of the speeches that did get some press here, Benjamin Netanyahu, who again spoke about the need to lay down a clear red line, a line that the Iranian programs could not cross, and that if they did, there would be military intervention. And I think where he's going is that line would be a 90% uranium enrichment, which is what you need for the bombs to be made. Right now they're enriching, I think, to 20%. It's not a huge jump given that with the technology that they have to go from 20 to 90. Our president has been reluctant to specify a red line other than they cannot acquire a nuclear weapon. The Romney campaign has been trying to tack a little closer to where Netanyahu is and lay down that red line. What do you make? Should there be a red line? Is that counterproductive to specify it?
I want to be very careful of what I say here, because I don't speak for the U.S. government or the U.S. mission, and I'm not now inside the United Nations. Mm-hmm. I'm out at the UN Foundation. So what I say is from observing.
Important disclaimer, you're not speaking for anybody other than...
Yeah. First of all, I think it's important for, especially at a key election time, for outside leaders not to interfere in American politics. And I think Netanyahu has laid enormous pressure on the president. I've never seen it done quite that way before. As for laying out your limits, specifying your limits, red lines, whatever you wish to call it, I think diplomacy is sometimes better done by holding your cards. You know where you're going to know. You know what's in your hand, or when you'll play that hand. But if you tell the other side exactly what you have, then everything's on the table in advance. There are still ways and means to work on this difficult issue that we haven't fully explored yet.
Welcome back to our special hour-long edition of Focus One with our special guest, Gillian Sorensen, Senior Advisor to the UN Foundation. We're going to shift gears here, and we're going to take some questions from our esteemed students, real bright kids, adults actually, not necessarily kids. Let's start off over here.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I was hoping you could describe the most interesting project you worked on while you were at the UN.
Well, one that was much in the public eye was that I was the one responsible overall for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in 1995. And that was a global commemoration of what the UN had done and what it was, what it hoped to be. We had activity in almost every country. And then there was quite an extraordinary gathering in the General Assembly that particular September when we had about 170 heads of government, heads of state coming to mark that historic occasion. And so it was a massive organizing role, but also a chance to encourage and inspire others around the country, like the United Nations associations, which exist in 100 American cities, but also in well over 100 countries around the world. And those are local NGOs, self-organized, that teach and encourage and inspire people to support and understand the United Nations and what's at stake and why it matters.
Just going to slide down the line.
Hi, my name is Julia. I was wondering what you think the future is like for climate change with the UN now that the Kyoto Protocol's commitment period is ending, and what you think is going to happen.
Well, there are some disappointments in that, but we cannot give up. We cannot abandon this. There are many new initiatives underway. both within countries and internationally. We'll call it something else. We'll have another conference in a matter of years. But I think in the last meeting in Rio this past summer, it was made abundantly clear for anybody who was listening that climate change is a very serious issue and that we have to address it. It's easy to say, well, it won't happen here. But if we think of the climate and environmental issues, even in Florida, that you've gone through these recent years and across the western part of our country with the drought and so on, clearly things have changed. So we hope that everyone, from political leaders right down to grassroots groups, will pay attention to this. And the UN associations will have special programs about this so that people know that it's real and that each of us can do something about it. I've discovered that little kids, junior high school students, take an interest in the environment and they understand it in a way. And it's a good place to start, to connect with them and to get them thinking about a larger world and something that matters to them.
Hi, my name is Jordan. Aside from climate change, what's been one of the more difficult projects you've worked on with the UN? One of the more difficult projects, I guess, you've worked on?
Well, for the United Nations, you mean? To me, if you're talking about difficulty, in a sense, everything is difficult, or it wouldn't come to the UN. If it was easy, it would have been solved at home. I always think of pairing peacekeeping with development, because you can't have true freedom if the poverty is so deep that half a country or more is caught in the poverty trap at the bottom. So difficulty, yes, the 16 peacekeeping operations out on the front lines today are daunting in the most difficult parts of the world, under circumstances that are in some cases intractable. But we have very brave soldiers. We have 120,000 peacekeepers coming from many different national militaries around the world, and they do good work. But on the other side of that is the work on poverty. And tremendous efforts and progress have been made. And we know we can do more and do better. We have the means, we have the knowledge. The question is, do we have the political will to do that? And to the extent that I or anybody else can commit to that and can look at they call it the Millennium Development Goals, that is those markers on clean water and nutrition and safe birth and primary education and so forth, the very basics of having a life where one can thrive and grow. That to me is the most difficult, the most challenging, and the most important. Here I am at this wonderful college, at New College in Sarasota. How lucky you are to have not just health and education, but information and mobility and access and a chance to learn and grow. A billion people on Earth don't have anything like that, even a decent roof over their head. So that issue, the existence of dire poverty, extreme poverty on this earth, is something that I think if I can do more in that area, if I can speak up about it or work in that area, that's what I would like to do.
Okay, I'm going to do the mic transfer, but as I do the mic transfer, I'm going to throw one more question in there. So,
right.
And that question is, I'm really curious, how many countries have you traveled to, and if you had to pick one country that you've never been to that you most would like to go, what would it be?
Oh, my. A country that I've never been to and hope to go to next year is India.
You've never been to India?
I've never been. And of course, it's a
been to India.
It's a great...
How is it possible that I was somewhere that you weren't?
I don't know. It has over 1 billion people. It has a rich history going back 1,000 years, art and culture and music and so forth, and interesting politics. It is a democracy. And that's where I hope to go next year.
It might be one of my favorite place for interesting. When I got off the plane there, my first impression was, oh my God, there's so many people here.
Yeah.
But it was just very, very colorful. So the senses, it was a sensory overload. It was.
Yeah, I have that trip on my calendar.
Hi, I'm Skylar. You mentioned earlier about your thoughts on how the media portrays the UN, specifically that they'll talk about the more interesting subjects because they want to reach, I guess, the issues that people are more prevalently concerned about. What are your thoughts on media coverage and the UN in general, and like where it falls short and what it can do to be better, and then what it does well?
Well, I said good news doesn't make news. You can turn that and say crisis and scandal make news. But the truth is there are tremendous opportunities for journalists who have initiative and who will follow the story and who will put a human face on the story. To say we're sheltering 20 million refugees, that's a number. But if you tell a story about a particular young girl or a certain family, then it begins to live and breathe. And I think those are powerful stories, compelling stories, and stories that move people, not just intellectually, but touch them. You know, the UN is so much more than speeches, although talk, of course, is our work, our tool of the trade. But the UN is about changing lives and saving lives. That's a matter of life and death. And when reporters will go further, reach further, listen better, and write some of those stories, I think they have remarkable things to tell. And I also wish that they would consider that broad range of the UN's work that I mentioned earlier, and not just focus on the latest peacekeeping crisis. It's a rich field of news and human stories, but it does need journalists who will go further and not just follow the herd.
My name is Evan, and my question would be geared and coming off of the idea of having a human connection with the work that you have done and talking about issues such as poverty, which for me is very humbling to know the situation of others throughout the world. And as having an interest in climate change, many of these issues are obviously global, but was there ever an experience you had that really made your job worth it, like meeting someone in particular or traveling to another country, or maybe simply in New York City, an experience that really you felt defined your job and defined you and your job?
I remember traveling with Secretary General Kofi Annan, and he was actually headed up to Minnesota. He came from Ghana, as I'm sure you know, but he had a chance to be a scholarship student at Macalester College up in northern Minnesota, a small liberal arts school up there, and he was going there for a commencement. But on the way, he and his traveling group stopped in St. Paul, I believe, and there we went to a place called the Center for Victims of Torture, and there are a number of them around the country. And in his remarkable way, he said to the people there, "Tell me your story." This was not a hospital, it was an old Victorian house. There may have been 20 or 25 people there. By various means, they had been rescued and somehow made their way here. And each story was very different. And some of them were no older than you are. And some of them had been activists or dissenters and had been trying to bring down an unjust government or doing things that were provocative in that way. We would consider that, I think, positive. But in any case, they were arrested or imprisoned. In other cases, they had done nothing. It was their brother who was the activist, or it was someone in their family, but the family had left, so they were snatched and imprisoned. One of them said he'd been kept in a space the size of a toilet stall for almost 2 years. And the only light he saw was from a tiny corner, a break in the ceiling up at the top. That was the only way he knew whether it was night or day. And he said, I'm here now, and my body is beginning to recover, but I don't know if my soul will ever recover. I don't know if I can put the pieces back, or if I can ever understand how another human being can do to a person the things that were done to me. And he was very calm, and then tears just came to his eyes, and he said, but what I can hardly bear is that I'm here and so many are still there. And for people who are there, the worst possible thing is to think that nobody knows and nobody cares and no one is speaking up and they are forgotten. And these stories tumbled out one after the other, mostly speaking very quietly, and in the beginning very calmly, but always with tears coming to the eyes. And the Secretary General himself was so deeply moved. And he had done this many times in refugee camps and in other places. And we were reminded that there are a number of centers for victims of torture. And that the only way they can really deal with it is finally to speak of it. The same with child soldiers. If they cannot say it, it burns and it devours them inside. So the process of speaking it, of being in a circumstance where they can put it out there and say, this was done to me. Or in the case of the child soldiers, I did this. But to begin to acknowledge that they were children and they were victims and so on. These experiences, these encounters, these stories, which come right from the heart, are so moving and so powerful. And you come away grateful for what you have, but also just moved to the point of saying, I have to do what I can. I'll never be the Secretary General, or I'll never be the President of the United States, but I can do something. Maybe in my community regarding poverty, because that exists everywhere, including here. Or maybe through my school, or through an NGO, or through political activity, or other ways. But I have to act on what I now know and understand. Those are the kind of experiences and stories. Not just saying 20 million refugees, but hearing those personal stories that move me to the core, and that sometimes keep me awake at night, and that motivate me, and that have moved me as best I can do to devote myself to this work. It is literally my mission and my passion, and it will be to my last day.
Good morning. My name is Andrea. Thank you for answering our questions. I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about how you mentioned earlier you link sort of when you think about these peacekeeping forces to development activities as well. This also goes back to what you were saying about how we can work in our own communities. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how the UN is engaging that sort of relief to development continuum, where opportunities are, and within the UN or outside, perhaps through NGOs or individuals.
Yes. Well, development, meaning working on the circumstances of poverty, has become an enormous effort by the UN. The UN Development Program is, I believe, the largest department of any. It has a big center, of course, in headquarters, but its work in all the countries, the poorest countries of the world, is ongoing every single day. Now, that said, even the wealthy countries like this one has deep poverty. We have 20% of our children, 20% live in poverty. It may not be the kind of dire poverty, extreme poverty that I was describing earlier, but it is poverty where they're not sure what they will be eating tomorrow, or where they run short of money for food, or where they are literally homeless. So we don't have to go 10,000 miles away to find this, which is to say that issues of development can be, you can in effect practice, you can exercise, you can try to learn more about it or do more about it close to home. Eleanor Roosevelt used to say, peace begins in small ways close to home. But so does work of this kind. Or as you get older, you can link with an NGO and seek an opportunity for service abroad, maybe a summer, maybe a couple of years, working on issues of development. And that's a great way to learn and to see, is this the kind of work that you care about or can make a contribution for? And I don't mean just a financial contribution, although that's needed, of course, but to be there, to put yourself there, or to organize, or to lobby, and so forth. Because in this, of course, governments have a major role. Citizens have also a key role, but it's both coming together that way. For the UN, I think this is the way of the future. Peacekeeping will always have, alas, its role, because of the 193 countries, there are some that are led by rogues and thugs. I wish that were not the case, but that is. So those circumstances probably will go on. But at the same time, the number of developing countries, that is, countries with a high level of poverty, are close to 130. And that's where we want to focus work, to empower those who are in circumstances of poverty, to press the governments to do the right thing, make the right choices on their budgets, to commit resources to those circumstances of poverty, and then to be sure in our own country with our foreign assistance that that foreign aid goes to the source, that it is accountable money, and that we do the most that we can to help others who are in extreme circumstances.
Okay, just looking at my clock, I think we have about 10 minutes or so left, so probably not enough time for an additional question from everybody, but I'd love to take another 2 or 3. So you have a question.
Could you describe a bit more about what goes into a UN peacekeeping mission?
Yes, classic peacekeeping was more a matter of keeping a status quo so that diplomats would be allowed to do their work. Peacekeeping didn't really exist at the founding of the UN in 1945. It came about a few years later in response to crisis situations. There are no UN soldiers as such. We don't have a UN army. What we do is, in effect, borrow. We use troops from national armies around the world who contribute their soldiers to be UN peacekeepers for the duration, for perhaps 2 years or less or more. And they wear their national uniforms, but then a blue beret or a blue helmet to show that they're part of the peacekeeping troop. Those soldiers go to the front lines in these very difficult situations. They are not an offensive army. They do carry light arms, but they're not a war-making army, if you understand what I mean. They are peacekeepers, which means the circumstances need to allow a peace to keep, if you will. Sometimes they are have more robust orders in certain circumstances, but that is relatively recent. It's a very difficult situation and a delicate line to walk, to protect civilians, to keep the warring parties apart, to do what is needed in terms of assessment, analysis, raising the alarms, alerting governments what is about to happen, and creating the circumstances for peace to arrive. For those peacekeeping ops to happen, they need the mandate, that is the directive from the Security Council. And that council requires the 5 permanent members to say yes. And that's where we're stymied in Syria, because the permanent 5 are not all together on that circumstance. So it's difficult, but there have been over time many dozens of peacekeeping operations, and I think under those tough circumstances, they've done a remarkable job. I might add one other point. The United States does not give peacekeeping soldiers. It's a hot political issue here. We do not do that. But we do help in other important ways with communications, equipment, with logistical support and transport. And that's a very critical contribution to peacekeeping.
What's your career advice for someone who wants to be involved with the UN?
My career advice? Well, first of all, I think you're on the right track. You came to this session. Some of you are studying international relations right now. I trust that you have or are working toward fluency, real fluency, in at least one foreign language. I hope that you will be looking for opportunities to study abroad. If you can do a full year, all the better. Perfect your language skill, immerse yourself in another culture, and then think about seeking an advanced degree. That would be very important. If you want to work in the diplomatic world, you would probably get a degree in international relations, but also economics, or public health, or law, or in certain ways even business. That knowledge can be applied to diplomatic work. I hope that right now you're thinking of yourselves as global citizens and immersing yourself, reading and following the news of the world, so you know what's happening out there, and you understand the role of the United States and the leadership role that we have, and the workings of the UN and so forth, the role of international organizations, and there are many, and the role of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. You may want to seek a job with an NGO at an early age and get more experience out on the front lines, work with refugees or something, then come back, perhaps seek a job in the United Nations. I certainly hope you will be active in the UN associations around the country. And you may wish to go into the foreign, into the foreign service. Then you would be part of the United States diplomatic service, representing this country abroad at embassies and consulates and maybe at the UN. And that, of course, is a profession of its own, and a very exciting and challenging and distinguished profession. You have to be ready to live overseas, which in my view is exciting and fascinating to do. And that's a profession of its own. Or otherwise you may bring your advanced studies to the international work in another way, through the law, medicine, international studies, language skills, and so forth. So there are a number of ways of coming toward that, but right now you're advancing your education, and that's the most important thing.
Gillian, that was wonderful. It was truly an honor and a treat to have you visit our campus this morning.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Ladies, thank you so much for getting up early on a Friday morning and asking such terrific questions. And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week on another edition of Focus One.